Welcome to this week's edition of FIREside Chats. I'm Joe Cohn, FIRE's Legislative and Policy Director, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues today, Sarah McLaughlin and Adam Steinbaugh, to talk about two cases that FIRE has been monitoring of late, one at Texas State University and the other one at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Sarah, why don't you tell us about the situation at Texas State University?
Sure. So last month at Texas State, a student published an op-ed called "Your DNA is an Abomination" at the student newspaper, the University Star. Inevitably, a lot of controversy occurred both on campus and online. So the university responded by saying they were offended by it, and then the student government took it a step further, calling for the resignation of the writer as well as the editor-in-chief. And he also called for the resignation of, or he said that if resignations weren't forthcoming, he would call for an emergency meeting about the funding. And so the paper is now facing a funding threat. And then in addition to that, Texas State Assistant Vice President of Communications said that he would be looking further into the publication. So now we have a funding threat and an investigation. So
I think one of the first things that I want to talk about here is the op-ed itself. So the op-ed, titled "Whiteness, Your DNA is an Abomination." My gastroenterologist would probably agree that my DNA is an abomination, but probably doesn't have much to do with my whiteness. It starts with some pretty controversial stuff. I mean, he says, "When I think of all white people I've ever encountered, whether they've been professors, peers, lovers, friends, police officers, etc., there is perhaps only a dozen I would consider decent." And then it concludes with, "Remember this, I hate you because you shouldn't exist. You are both the dominant apparatus on the planet and the void in which all cultures upon meeting you die." So it's pretty strong word stuff in the there. So one of you want to talk to us about why it's protected speech?
Well, I mean, you can start off with there are a couple well-recognized and very narrow exceptions to the First Amendment. And I think that there are probably two that are most apt here, and then a third that people think exists but doesn't actually exist. The first is that a true threat is not protected speech. And a true threat is a serious expression of an intent to do violence or to take unlawful action. That is not in any way apparent here. There's no statement saying that they are actually going to do anything at all. They are making remarks that are going to offend a lot of people, but they're not saying they're going to do anything. And just wishing or saying that white people should not exist, or whatever point it is he was trying to make, wishing is not the same thing as threatening. There was a Supreme Court case, for example, where a police officer or a police secretary, upon hearing that President Reagan had been shot, said something to the effect of, "Well, I hope the next time they actually get him." And the Supreme Court looked at it and said, well, merely hoping that violence comes to people or that something bad happens to even the president is not the same thing as saying, I'm going to do this. So this isn't a true threat, for one. Two, you have the incitement standard. And the incitement standard essentially looks to whether or not you are intending to get others to take unlawful action and whether or not there's the likelihood that others will take that unlawful action. Again, the author here is not actually calling for particular action, and nobody is going to read a student newspaper and say, well, this person wants to end whiteness, let's go end whiteness right now. So it doesn't rise to incitement either. So the last exception that a number of people think exists is hate speech, but there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. So you can say, I dislike white people, or I hate white people, or the world would be better off without white people. And while a lot of people might say, hey, that's very hateful and it's speech, so therefore it's hate speech, that the Supreme Court has unanimously held that there is no exception to the First Amendment for speech which is hateful on the basis of race. So if it's
or on other bases,
yes.
yeah, and I think that's good. I mean, I think it's true that we don't have a broad hate speech exemption. It's clear that under all of the case law that would be applicable that this is protected speech, but the student body president is advancing a different argument, which is it might be protected, but why should we have to fund you student newspaper if you're not going to use better editorial judgment? If you want to raise money through your advertisements, knock yourself out, but you're not going to get money from us. Sarah, what do you think about that?
It's funny, we saw almost the same exact situation a couple years ago at Wesleyan University after the Wesleyan Argus published an op-ed from a student who was criticizing Black Lives Matter, expressing his disagreement with the movement, and it was almost the same thing. Instead of students thinking, I can publish an op-ed, explaining why I think he's wrong, or I can, write something on social media explaining why I think those points were wrong, people, again, immediately move to defunding the paper. It's so quickly that people are moving to removing a forum for these discussions rather than trying to engage in the discussions as well.
And let's face it, a student newspaper is where there, it's a good place for controversial opinions. And I think that if every university said, oh, the student newspaper published something that offended a lot of people, or offended a small group of people, or offended this administrator or that administrator, and we should defund them on that basis, there wouldn't be very many student newspapers. So while people might question the judgment in publishing the piece or in writing the piece and criticize the newspaper on that basis, it's a bad idea to attempt to withdraw funding on that basis, and it would violate the First Amendment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important point. But one other thing that happened here is that the university president weighed in with a statement of her own. From President Denise Traub, she said in her statement, "Dear Bobcat community, I'm deeply troubled by the racist opinion column that was published in the November 28, 2017 issue of the University Star titled 'Your DNA is an Abomination.' The column's central theme was abhorrent and is contrary to the core values of inclusion and unity that our Bobcat students, faculty, and staff hold dear. As president of the university that celebrates its inclusive culture, I detest racism in any manifestation." So far, so good. While I appreciate that the Star is a forum for students to freely express their opinions, I expect student editors to exercise good judgment in determining the content that they print. The Star editors have apologized for the column and are examining their editorial process. What do you folks think about that statement?
I think it's fine for a university president to express disagreement with something a student or faculty member says. They have their own speech rights too. It's, if they don't like something, they're free to say it. But it starts to get into different territory when they say they expect good judgment out of their students and of what they say or write. When there are strings attached to it, as it appears there might be now, like an investigation, that's when we start to get concerned, because it's not just a president saying, I disagree with it. It's them saying, I disagree with it, and we might actually punish it.
Right, because when your boss tells you, I expect you to arrive by 9 a.m., it isn't necessarily just voluntary. So, that's interesting, Sarah. There are some other students, however, that are defending the author of the op-ed piece, and they're arguing that the piece is simply raising issues that everyone is thinking about in terms of white privilege and what that means. And the author of the piece defended himself as well, saying, "The article speaks for itself. Though my language, especially when I claim to have only ever met 12 decent white people, could be deemed as hyperbolic," parentheses, he says, "just barely, it has accomplished its goal, starting a conversation and outing racists." Thoughts?
I think he's definitely right that it has started a conversation.
And I think that often gets overlooked. People talk about, racist speech having no value. I've always thought that one of the most important things about racist speech being unpunished is it puts it out there in the public to see, to be put under scrutiny, because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And when people are afraid to show their true colors, that doesn't get rid of the warts, it just hides them. So I actually thought that was an interesting point that the student made. We're keeping an eye on the situation, though, because as I understand it, there's a change.org position. petition that is being circulated, calling on the University Star to be defunded. And when I last checked yesterday, it had gained 1,782 signatures. So that's the situation at Texas State University. Do you folks want to add anything else before we move on to the next topic?
No.
I would just add that we are continuing to watch that, and I think that if the student government follows through on its very unwise threat to withdraw funding for the student newspaper, I think that should the student newspaper seek legal counsel, I think it would be quite damaging to the university and to the student government to defend themselves against a lawsuit they would lose.
Well said, Adam. So the other case we talk about, we're going to talk about today, is completely different. And FIRE, for all of the viewers, monitors campus censorship across the country. So whether the censorship is happening at a 4-year college in Texas or at a 2-year community college in the Finger Lakes, we are there to see it. And a case that's caught our eye is one at University of Nebraska, Lincoln, where actually a lot is going on. The controversies were all set into motion by a conservative student as part of a student organization trying to table outside on campus. Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit more about how that situation is unfolding?
Yeah, this is a good example of a university administration coming down on every participant here. Turning Point USA is a conservative organization that will often send out people to campuses to try to put together student organizations or get students to set up student organizations or student chapters at various universities. And a student at the University of Nebraska Lincoln set up a table in a public area outside of some building on campus, trying to get people to sign up to join a chapter of TPUSA and just generally raise awareness for conservative points of view. And during that petitioning activity, she had not asked for permission from the university to do this, so an employee of the university came out and was recorded telling her that she had to move to a free speech area or free speech zone.
One thing that's interesting that I want to interject real quickly is that in the video, she's not only just moved there, but she's told, or the police will be called. And then the employee says, you can have all the free speech all you want, but you cannot hand out propaganda. So kind of talks about it like it's a free speech buffet. Get all of your, mashed potatoes, chicken fingers, and free speech you want. Just no propaganda served here. And it was kind of silly, but a pretty outrageous statement caught on videotape about restricting speech in open outdoor area to a designated zone. And
the university has, to my knowledge, they've apologized for it, or they've acknowledged that this was not the correct thing to do, and they've tried to explain it as saying, well, that's a free speech area or free speech zone is just something that the employees here informally refer to it as, this open area on campus. So that was questionable behavior by the university, but at some point during that demonstration, a professor and a teaching assistant or a lecturer had a counter demonstration criticizing the TPUSA student and the TPUSA organization because the organization operates what they call a professor watch list, which purports to identify liberal professors or professors whose political views they dislike or believe are invading the classroom or some such. And so they maintain a list on their website of professors who they believe are indoctrinating students. A professor of the University of Nebraska held a sign and marched around outside of this table saying, hey, please put me on your list too, I want to join on this list. And the lecturer during this demonstration made some disparaging remarks about the student, and when the student pulled out her cell phone and started recording this, the lecturer gave her the one-finger salute, or flip to the bird.
And you know, and that seems, you know, interesting because, you know, there's a lot of case law about how, you know, just giving the finger is protected speech, and that kind of makes sense. You know, it's a basic criticism, and if it's protected, you know, to hold up your foam finger number one, you know, then why would it be unprotected to give someone a different finger that's critical?
Exactly. And so there were, for example, there was a Supreme Court case out of Georgia, or a Georgia Supreme Court case, in which a gentleman gave a pastor the one-finger salute from the back of the church. And the court said, you know, this doesn't amount to fighting words, and this is not enough to amount to a breach of the peace or disruptive conduct, however offensive it might have been. So the mere act of giving someone the finger, especially in the context of political speech, is protected.
Is this complicated at all by the fact that this is a lecturer to a student?
It does complicate it because there is an employment relationship, and a public university has some leeway to police how professors and lecturers and students interact by virtue of that employment relationship. So if a professor marched into the front of their classroom and, you know, flipped two birds and made disparaging remarks about students in the classroom, that would certainly be punishable. Now, juxtapose that with a professor saying, let's review, you know, different types of offensive speech, or the historical background of giving the finger. A university could not punish a professor for saying, here, you know, the Greek, you know, ancient Greeks used to use the finger as a method of insulting someone.
Right. And while this is also happening on campus, it isn't happening in the context of a classroom or any interaction that either the student or this lecturer have with each other. It's, you know, one person taking a political position, and the other person expressing the other political position, and it getting heated.
Exactly. The First Amendment doesn't allow the government, so, you know, here the public university, to say that, you know, you're allowed to disagree, but it has to be polite and it has to be non-offensive agreement. So while it would have been preferable for the lecturer here to go to the student and say, I disagree with your organization and with this professor watch list because of A, B, and C, it's also protected to say, I disagree with your organization, you know. So
I want to talk about real quickly some of the fallout that's happened here. The university received, well, I don't want to say received, there was an op-ed published by 3 Nebraska legislators who saw this incident, and they were concerned about how that reflected upon the university's commitment to make the institution welcoming to students of all political persuasions. And they brought up this incident, and they brought up the free speech zones, and they also brought up that the English department had a statement of values on its website page that included things like social justice, and they questioned, why is the English department taking stances like that as opposed to committing itself on the website to core English department curriculum, literature, poetry, etc. And immediately after that, as I understand it, or shortly thereafter, the institution took an adverse action against the graduate student instructor, removing teaching responsibilities.
Well,
so
it was
what
actually,
do we make of all these facts?
It was actually before that, right after all this happened and this kind of blew up on the internet, they pulled the professor or the lecturer out of her classes and reassigned her to other duties and said, oh, well, we have to do this for your safety because there have been threats. She apparently did not ask for that to happen, so it was an involuntary sort of move. Then they also said, well, her actions were also unprofessional and, you know, fell beneath our standards. And ultimately, after the criticism by the state legislators, the university said, well, they announced in a letter to the governor and to the legislators saying, we are not going to hire her, you know, next year or next semester.
And that's pretty concerning, and one of the reasons why we're going to continue monitoring the situation. I mean, generally, FIRE is always concerned about legislatures getting involved in curriculum choices and in particular trying to micromanage employment, decisions by institutions that have academic freedom implications to them as well. But the legislators probably do have a good point about their demand that the institution gets rid of its free speech zone. So it's a situation that I think we'll be monitoring. And thank you for joining us today in our conversation about these two cases. We look forward to having you join us in future Fireside Chats. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Sarah.